Hello, my name is Benjamin Lee, and I just want to welcome everyone. It is now 1 p.m., so we'll begin our presentation shortly. Today on January 18th, we'll have our presentation on linking airports to transportation planning. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen, or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box, and we'll be able to answer those after the presentation. Here is the sponsoring chapters, divisions, and universities. I would like to thank all of the participating chapters, divisions, and universities for making these webcasts possible. These are the list of upcoming webcasts. To register for these upcoming webcasts, please visit utahapa.org webcast and register for your webcast of choice. We are now offering distance education webcasts to help you get your ethics or law credits before the end of the year. These webcasts are available to view at utahapa.org webcast archive. To log your distance education CM credits, go to planning.org CM, select activities by provider, select APA Ohio chapter, then select distance education and select your webcast of choice. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook to receive up-to-date information on planning webcast series sponsored by chapters, divisions, and universities. We also upload the previous presentations on YouTube. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to planning.org CM, select today's date, and then select today's webcast. This webcast is available for 1.5 CM credit. At this time, I would like to introduce the presenters for today. Lisa Harmon is an environmental planner with 20 years experience with federal projects, 12 of which are associated especially with aviation planning and development. Her most recent work focuses on aviation and wildlife hazard management, as well as land use compatibility planning and interagency coordination for projects involving aviation. She holds a degree from the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University and Wells College. David is an airport and environmental planner with over 35 years experience with local and state agencies and airport consulting. He was an environmental planning manager at San Francisco International Airport during development of the new international terminal. His most recent work has included a range of environmental tasks in support of a major runway extension at Sonoma County Airport that will support direct airline service to Denver. He received a bachelor's degree from UC Davis and a master's in city and regional planning from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Derek is an aviation planner with the California Department of Transportation, Divisions of Aeronautics. He is located in their headquarters office in Sacramento, California. He received his bachelor's and master's degree in geography from California State University, Fullerton, with emphasis in urban and environmental planning. He is a champion for helping communities understand how public use airports can be integrated in local and regional planning programs using smart growth principles. And at this time, I'll hand it over to the first presenter, Lisa.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Okay, great. I want to thank Ben for all of his help this week, especially with setting up. He's been an absolute asset to APA, and we'd be really lost without him. Hang on, we're trying to move ahead to our first slide here.
No, I think you need to click on.
We're having trouble getting to the slide presentation then.
Try clicking the PowerPoint.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Today we tried to think about a context for today's discussion, and one of the things we wanted to talk about were some of the special situations, circumstances, and challenges that come up with airport projects. And a lot of times in transportation planning, we focus mostly on surface transportation. And one of the things about aviation is that we have to deal not only with what's on the ground, but what's up in the air, and we wanted to talk about that. In terms of what transportation links are available to connect airports with their surrounding communities, Dave and I looked at the experience that we had collectively, and we also tried to supplement our experience by looking at recent research. So we took our experience and then looked at the research and tried to compare them. And so what you'll see in today's presentation tries to present an amalgam of both of those things. Our objectives are simple. We wanted transportation planners and our colleagues who may be tasked in the future to consider connectivity with airports to have a better idea about what they need to think about when they go into such projects. We hope that you guys will be able to walk away today having a better understanding of what happens in an airport environment and what tools and things are available to you to help you when you may have that opportunity to link a surface transportation project to an aviation facility. To present today, we came up with a sort of narrative about how we want to go about this. We thought we'd start out with a brief discussion of airports, and we called that affectionately airport anatomy. It's very basic, and I'd like to offer an apology to the more sophisticated among us who probably know a lot of this background already. But we thought we'd start with a sort of 20,000-foot level about what happens at an airport. Then Dave's going to talk to us about the different types of airports that you may become involved with during your planning career by airport type, and then talk about the opportunities for links to other transportation modes that could happen with each type of airport. We'll talk briefly about constraints and considerations that you need to think about, and I'd like to emphasize that these discussions, because they have to take place in an hour, are quite general. For example, we were unable to discuss financing and transportation because that subject is simply too vast for talking about within an hour. And then because we're planners, no discussion would be complete without a discussion of smart growth, and Derek Kantar will pick up on that. So let's start out with a discussion of airport anatomy, and we hope you can walk away with a better understanding of what happens at an airport and some tips for what to do if you're asked to do a project at an airport. So let's start out with some basic definitions and talk about what happens at an airport. But the question is, what kind of thoughts do you need to have if somebody says, I'd like you to create a transportation link to your community, to a community airport? So one of the things about airports is that they're regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. And the Federal Aviation Administration promulgates what are known as FARs, or Federal Aviation Regulations, which are also codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. And basically, the FAA says that an airport is any area of land or water that can be used to land or take off aircraft. And that includes a variety of types of airports, such as heliports, which may be at the top of a building or in a parking lot, a seaplane base, or a spaceport. And if you get to work on a spaceport, I'm really jealous. Sounds like a great opportunity. So what are some of the vocabulary we need to think about? When we talk about the anatomy of an airport, we talk about airside and we talk about landside. Airside is the more complex side of an airport on some levels because it includes 3 dimensions rather than 2. The air side is the area where takeoff and landing happens. We have vehicles on the ground getting to and from airplanes. We have places where aircraft are parked. But all of these areas are regulated by the FAA with a variety of different definitions. For example, we have runway safety areas, or RSAs. We have safety areas around taxiways, known as TSAs. We have object-free areas. Every single portion of a land side has some sort of regulation or movement that can or cannot occur within it. And we also refer to this area frequently as the area inside the fence. It's secure, it's regulated. And that's where you may have navigational aids or other sort of devices. It's where the taxiways and the runways are and the airplanes. As we were saying before, there are a lot of areas within the fence that are heavily regulated by FAA. And one of them that we spend a lot of time being concerned with as airport planners is the runway protection zone, which is a trapezoidal area at the end of the runway. It's the area that airplanes and pilots depend on to be free of objects so that in the event of a controlled but emergency landing, they have a place to go if they land, if they overshoot the end of the runway or their takeoff, something goes wrong. And there are serious use limitations associated with this area. And the reason that's important to us as transportation planners is because the runway protection zone may vary according to the size of the runway or the type of aircraft or the type of navigation that's used. And it's a big, fat open space. Sometimes there may be existing roads within an RPZ, but the FAA has come down pretty hard on that lately, and no longer are we allowed to put roads in an RPZ. So the takeaway lesson here is that just because you see a lot of open space around an airport doesn't mean that it's empty space. Empty space and open space are not available to us as transportation planners all the time. It's probably open for a reason. So now let's talk about land side. As transportation planners putting links to airports, chances are about 99% that we're going to be working solely in the land side. And the land side, or outside the fence, is the area that's not used to operate aircraft. And when we talk about land side, generally we're referring to the area that's within 2 miles of the airport. One of the big things that happens in the land side areas of an airport is parking. That can be public parking, it can be employee parking, it can be privately operated parking. But for many, many airports, parking is the #1 revenue generator they have. So in a lot of cases, it's in their best interest on the financial side of the house. They have a lot of surface parking or garage parking. Other things that happen on the land side include ground transportation, shared vehicles, links to transit, roadways that are both public or perhaps internal roadways, and other businesses like rental car facilities or restaurants, things that people may likely use going to and from the airport, but they are not directly related to aviation. So that brings us to the terminal. And as an environmental planner, I like to think of the terminal as the edge habitat. It's what happens between the land side and the air side. And that's where you may sort of have things like, TSA, baggage areas, a big fat terminal building, and security. It's the boundary that separates the air side from the land side. Probably the greatest thing we need to remember as transportation planners when dealing with airports is that we have to deal with that third dimension. Airports are surrounded by a variety of what FAA refers to as imaginary surfaces, but they still have very real numbers and dimensions attached to them. They have approach surfaces or horizontal surfaces. And our goal right now is not to say that we need to understand what each and every mathematical calculation is, but as planners, we need to know that this area is out there. And it becomes really important if you're trying to, for example, if you wanted to put in a new roadway interchange that had a grade separation involved. Are you far enough away from a runway that your potential ramp up to an elevated roadway isn't going to intrude upon perhaps perhaps an imaginary surface of some sort. So as planners, we need to be aware that these surfaces exist, and there are places we can go to find out what their dimensions are. So how do we find out what those dimensions are and what the facilities are around our airport? There are certain tools that are available to us to help us, and the most important of them is the airport layout plan. Commercial service airports have an airport layout plan, which is required by the Federal Aviation Administration. This document would be available to you by asking the airport manager, and we're going to talk about its contents in a minute. There are also FAA regulations and advisory circulars. For example, FAA has design standards for everything, from internal roadways to runways to other facilities that belong on an airport. They're available from FAA's website. So if you're asked to do an airport project, to do an internal road, you might want to go to the FAA website and see what their design criteria are for that road. You may also want to look at the state transportation codes and the local zoning, planning and zoning codes to see how the local community envisions its interaction with the airport. Naturally, we have master plans, but not all airports have master plans. But those are also good resources if one exists. And the last thing is in California, we have things called airport land use compatibility plans. And they describe the relationship between airport development for an approximately 20-year period and nearby community development. And those help us to find out where potential conflicts could occur.
You're not over the screen.
Okay, about that airport layout plan. I can't emphasize enough how important this particular document is if you're being asked to do a project adjacent to or on an airport. The airport layout plan tells you not only what's on the airport and where the locations of potentially, object-free areas are, but it also tells you what's planned. It's sort of a diagrammatic depiction of a master plan. It also includes the airspace plan. So if you need to know whether you're working in an imaginary surface, what the dimensions of those surfaces are and where they are. One of the great things about an ALP is it also provides you with a property map. Oftentimes, airport agencies will own land that may or may not be contiguous to the airport, but you'll need to know if your project is going to be affecting any airport-related property, because as an FAA obligated, as a federally obligated facility, you'll be working on federally obligated property. And one thing that we can never forget as planners is that FAA must approve everything that's on an ALP. So even if you're not proposing an aviation project, but it affects federally obligated property, FAA has to review that before it can be shown on the ALP. And nothing can be constructed at an airport unless it's shown on an ALP. So just to summarize, as transportation planners, what we need to know is that by and large, transportation planning is land-side planning. Everything we do, all of our links to transportation are going to happen on the land side. We're not going to be going inside the fence. That may change in the future, but I don't think that's going to change in the foreseeable future. The other thing we need to remember is that planning near airports is 3D. You may not be planning on the air side, but perhaps the imaginary surfaces that are associated with the air side extend beyond the fence. You need to be aware of that. The other thing is that, as we said before, empty space is not open space. It is not available space. Just because there's nothing in an area of an airport doesn't mean that it's developable. Third thing, don't forget to ask for the ALP diagram. And most importantly, if you have a job that's going to happen on or even, within 2 or 3 miles of an airport, it's worth your while to talk to the airport operator. And that airport operator might be the city or the county or an airport board, but you want to get involved with them early and often. So that's all I have to say. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, David Dietz, now to talk about airports and opportunities for ground transportation links.
Thank you. The next bit will continue the sort of background information by talking about 4 categories of airports on the broad continuum. Work into trends that will be useful background material for you, and then get into the meat of this, which is opportunities, constraints, things that may directly relate to transportation planning. For our discussion today, we've generated 4 sort of generic types of airports, and it's useful for our discussion. Will help you understand the spectrum, but realize that these are not distinct types that are created by the FAA. They are intended to be descriptive. The FAA focuses on airports in a much more narrowly defined role that wouldn't be particularly useful. So we came up with this spectrum. In discussions today, a little bit of vocabulary to help you along. Commercial in the context of airports basically means airline service. Hub has both a generic meaning of, connections for airline service, but in this context, a hub is an airport that in planes, that it has passenger boardings of at least 0.05% of all those in the United States. Now, you don't need to remember the number, but think of these as the busy airline airports. Some of them are extraordinarily busy. The lower end of the spectrum, the FAA divides them into small, medium, large, which you don't need to remember. But these are the places that you think of as the major hub airports. There are lesser categories called commercial non-hub, which also have airline service, but at a lower level of frequency. We'll come to that in a minute. We've divided the general aviation airports into a metropolitan and a sort of rural ex-urban. General aviation basically means privately owned aircraft that are not airliners. There's some nuances to that, but for your purposes, think of them of Bob or Mary's own personal aircraft, corporate aircraft. It can be the full spectrum, but it's basically privately owned. Starting with commercial hubs, this is a picture of Chicago O'Hare. This is really the quintessential major airport. You'll notice multiple runways, as long straight roads that don't go anywhere, and a whole spaghetti network of taxiways to connect them to the terminal, the maintenance facilities, multiple runways in different directions to account for different wind conditions, different lengths for different categories of aircraft, a very complex setting. Since presumably all of you have traveled, you certainly know about major airports, acres of parking, parking structures. Because of the concentration of people, you'll see most of them have very extensive types of public transit. We'll come back to that in a minute. Ground transportation is huge. They're going to have their own interchanges. And in addition to the passenger service, which may be very visible, you're likely to see cargo and other sorts of things on there. Normally, these airports will have multiple terminals, huge land holdings, and so they're, in essence, a city on their own and will be in various obvious spots in your current transit and transportation system. At the smaller end of the spectrum are the commercial non-hub airports, and these are ones that have airline service, but they may only have 3 to 12 flights a day. The thing about their airfield is, it's much simpler. Normally they'll have 1, maybe 3, occasionally 4 runways, but generally they will be shorter. If there's a lot of general aviation light aircraft, they may have a secondary runway parallel to one of them to sort of act as an extra lane to accommodate the capacity. They will likely have higher quality instrument approaches, which means that the airspace is going to be a bigger constraint around the facility. This happens to be the airport near our office. Our office is about 1 mile to the right. We have one of our corporate planes based here, and we also use the airline service to get up to, this is north of San Francisco, about an hour. So this is very common of that lower category airport. The types of things you'll see at this airport will be not only the airline service, but the reality is this airport is going to be dominated by general aviation. The commercial aviation use is going to be less than 10% of all the activity. These kinds of airport, you'll expect to see both transient corporate aircraft, but also base ones. You expect to have jet space there, larger turboprops. You may have some small package delivery, small aircraft, FedEx, UPS kind of folks, collecting cargo and moving it into a larger one. There may be a fair amount of employees here, certainly not like a Chicago O'Hare, but this will be not only the airline side of it, but also corporate and other aviation-related services. Parking lots are going to be important to not only the airline service here, but also the businesses. And one of the interesting features is you commonly find is there will be an airport shuttle service from this particular smaller regional airport to one of the major hub airports. And the airports basically do this because there is usually some revenue from parking or from the service itself. And they also know that they can only compete in certain markets. And so it's okay to keep them in people's minds by having them grabbing the airport shuttle here, keeps them in front of the public. So that's one of the things you can look at in terms of either having a public or private shuttle service to connect with the major airports. The next one down is a pure general aviation airport. In other words, it will not have any scheduled airline service, but the facility may look just about the same. Long runways, high-quality instrument approaches. This happens to be Teterboro in New Jersey. Again, a classic business airport. Depending upon the type of competing airports in the region, the runway length, it can either be a very high concentration of jets and larger turboprops, or it can be largely single and twin engine piston. But this will be a very high activity level place. They're likely to have air traffic control towers, and in many ways will look like an airline airport in terms of their facilities and size. The key thing about this from a transportation set of considerations is that these tend to be busy places, whether it's a lot of business jet traffic or it's smaller piston aircraft. They tend to have high volumes of traffic, will very often have hundreds of aircraft, and with this becomes extensive parking areas, both for the businesses. There may be rental cars, there may be employees involved in maintenance, refurbishing, catering, all the things that go with these businesses. So one of the things you look at for these classes of airport is there may be issues in terms of surface transportation capacity. There may also be opportunities for transit because you'll have people not only working after hours, but a lot more of an 8 to 5 operation for a lot of the facilities. So there'll be some opportunities there for you. At the smallest end of the spectrum, we've got a general aviation airport in Wisconsin. You can see this one happens to have a single runway, may have a secondary runway if crosswinds are a big issue. Runways tend to be shorter. They tend to have lower quality instrument approaches, which means the airspace, although still a constraint nearby, will be less so. The orientation will be more recreational, which means that you're likely to have off-peak use, weekend use, other things like that. Like I say, it'll be a mixture of piston. There may be sailplanes. This kind of airport might also have crop dusters, other things that may relate to any agricultural or forestry, other things in the vicinity. Do not tend to have air traffic control towers. Things are a lot more informal. And again, these are probably, as we'll come back to, not a great impact in terms of surface transportation or much of an opportunity for transit related. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of where things expected to go in terms of forecast broadly at the national level, and some of the components that may affect how you relate to airports in your particular community. The FAA is right now projecting that as the economy recovers, things will come back to the fast pace of additional passenger service. They're talking about over a 50% growth over the next 20 years, just in terms of volume of passengers. The other trend that will affect individual airports is there continues to evolve the increasing average size of aircraft. If you've been flying commercially for years, you may remember the days not too long ago when the 18-passenger Bondurante was a common at some of the smaller airports. These days, things are getting to the point where, unless you live in Alaska or an outlying place, the smallest aircraft you're going to be likely to see at a non-hub airport is probably going to be 50 passengers. Even the regional jets have increased in size to the point where there are now going to be introduced regional jets that have the same seating capacity as some of the smaller 737s. So it's important to realize that small markets may be seeing some changes. If they can't fill up the plane, they're going to lose their service, and that obviously affects your ability to connect in any of your programs. The other thing that continues to plague general aviation, as it does many other transportation industries, is the volatility in the fuel prices. What this has done, since that is a large share of the variable price component to providing airline service, is it affects the ability at the margin. A marginal operation can be dropped. Fuel prices can be enough to put a particular connection from a smaller community to a hub out of reach from a financial standpoint. The other thing going on is this is becoming more and more of a concentrated industry. Over the last dozen years, a dozen of the major airlines have merged to form 6. So you're getting more and more concentration, fewer airlines, and this indirectly can also affect the type of service you have and the size of aircraft, volume of passengers, all of which translate into peak traffic effects and potential transit opportunities. One of the big questions I have as an airport planner is, where are we going to put all these 400 million additional passengers annually? A lot of our major airports are already severely constrained for aircraft as well as parking. Terminals, you can keep squeezing them in, but the question is, in certain regions, it's going to be really interesting to see how these are accommodated. Because it's not just the passengers, but there'll be an indirect effect that will affect employees, hours of operation. Airports, out where I am, San Francisco Airport has a tiny amount of real estate, say, to compare to Chicago. So when they wanted to build a new terminal, they had to tear down about half the buildings on the airport and make everything go up more. So the constraints are going to become very real in metro areas. And so my big question is this an opportunity for intercity rail or other types of transit? Because California is busily trying to do their high-speed rail, and we'll see where that goes. Great idea. We'll see if it'll ever work. But in areas where you have an existing rail corridor, there may be an opportunity to really make use of that. So that would be, I guess, the thing to keep an eye on in this kind of situation. Some other more micro-scale things to keep a look at. Well, you probably all know, just as travelers, that the so-called low-cost airlines continue to nibble away at the domestic market. It has reached the point where Southwest Airlines now has the most daily passenger seats of any domestic airline. They have passed Delta and United. And this is true for some of the smaller low-cost ones. This is becoming an increasingly large share of the market. These folks tend to draw from a much larger area than the major airlines that are heritage airlines from earlier times. People that are very price sensitive, particularly those going on vacations, are going to be willing to drive longer distances for these kind of lower fares. This makes it a greater challenge in terms of transit service, because this will give you a much larger dispersed pattern that might be for the other airlines. So it may affect your routes, it may affect the size of buses you use. All those things have to be considered when you look at the low-cost airlines. A specialized subset of that is the resort airlines, and they're going to be especially challenging to connect into the transit system. They often operate unusual hours. They may have an early evening departure, late night departure, depending upon the destination. They normally are not every day of the week, so maybe only a couple times a week. And so all of that increases the challenge. A broader issue for all of the smaller airline airports is just inherent volatility. If you are at the low end of the passenger volumes, you're going to get things that get started, get dropped. Airline services will change from one airline to another. They'll change aircraft sizes on you. All of that means forecasting for transit, local roads, a lot tougher to do. It also means just planning and financing project gets more challenging when you cannot count on any consistency in the volume of passengers or traffic. This is not likely to change. There's nothing in the trends we see that will reduce the volatility. Broader discussion of the future of general aviation, looking at the various classes of aircraft. Even the very optimistic FAA is seeing that the piston-powered aircraft fleet is going to shrink. That is just the pure total number of active aircraft is going to decline slowly. The FAA believes that after 10 years it's going to start perking up again and crawling back towards today's peak. They're vague on why, and frankly I'm skeptical. It would really need to change how the industry works for that to be likely. Probably not terribly critical in any case, since this crowd, as we'll come to, is not going to generate a lot in terms of either surface traffic or transit demand. The one bright spot I should mention just in passing is there's a couple of categories, one called light sport aircraft, the other more broadly experimental, which tend to be a lot more modern and interesting aircraft. A lot of these are home-built from very elaborate pre-manufactured components. Many of these are much sexier in a broad way, more sports car-ish, if you will, as well as some that harken back to the early days of aviation. And those, although it's a small percentage of the larger piston market, have seen sustained growth. Potentially of more interest to transit planners and transportation planners is the business crowd. And that would be a turboprop, which is basically a jet engine with a propeller attached to it, and a pure jet, which is obviously a business jet. This has seen continued growth for many years, still a small segment of the market, but one that continues to grow. Obviously congestion, road congestion to travel from point A to point B, the increasing hassle factor of getting through a commercial airport, having to get there early, time it takes to get through TSA, all the thing that makes the total time of connecting from point A to point B more difficult is fueling the demand for corporate aircraft, charter, and that whole package. No obvious reason that any of this is going to be less attractive in the future. So the FAA's forecast growth in this segment of the market seems very, very plausible. In terms of things that are useful for planners, generally at general aviation airports, the only segment you're probably going to be very interested in are the employees because of the concentration they're more likely to have during peak transportation times and also the peak number of employees at a particular location that will make a better connection to transit. Some major corporations sort of run their own internal airline, and your community may have that kind of regular service. Normally they'll have their own coach connections or other ones that they'll be serving themselves, but if you have one of those, maybe there's an opportunity to connect it in. At the smaller generation airports, because they're non-peak, small volumes, not likely to have much connection to either traffic issues or transit. Bit on cargo, obviously a much narrower market, but could be very important in some of your communities. Air cargo is a big enough industry, and it obviously then connects from airports to roads, and in some cases could well be rail. So there's definitely a reason to keep an eye on this. The FAA is talking about forecast doubling of the domestic air cargo segment and tripling of the international cargo. Even if these are optimistic, everything we've seen in the recent history says that this segment of the market is going to grow. So if you're working from a facility that has cargo, expect that to be bigger. One of the things is that the percentage of cargo that are on dedicated all-cargo flights, that is an all-cargo airline, no passengers, just a crew and nothing but boxes in the back, that segment's increasing. The other thing about cargo, it is even more narrowly concentrated than airlines are. There are fewer airlines that fly cargo and fewer airports that have major cargo. So if you've got air cargo service of any substantial sort in your community, expect that to grow. There's been during the fluctuation of fuel prices and downshift in the economy, at the lower end of the spectrum, there has been some noted change from aircraft to trucks because of reliability and frequency of service issue. This is not so much an issue at the major ones, but at the smaller ones. But depending upon your community, that may or may not be relevant. It's something to inquire about. From a transportation standpoint, obviously the issue of truck volumes, cargo is important. Rail transfer in some cases may be part of this. The other thing is employees. Depending upon the nature of the cargo, you may have not only the daytime, but late evening sorting facilities for the small cargo. And as I said, those places that have major cargo are likely to keep it, and you're not likely to see new places. Larger commercial airports can be the major components of a transportation system, and in some cases could also act as a transit hub. Got a couple examples I want to run by you to show what the potential may be. The only example we have domestically that I'm aware of where there's an airport system linked to the rail system, both regional and national, is the airport in Newark, and it has both connections to Amtrak and also the New Jersey transit system. What we found, though, is that while there's been great success in connecting to the regional system, the use by Amtrak users is very, very small. It's just never gelled. Even with combined tickets, let me try that again. Oops, over shut mark. Even with the use of tickets that allow you to purchase both your rail and aviation connection all in one ticket, it's been of limited interest for Amtrak users, but very successful for regional. The thing in doing this, to try and put this together yourself, you can look to the work done by the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, and New Jersey Transit as the main leaders in this, to put together a consortium to jointly plan this. A lot of airport, a lot of money. Whether this is exportable to other areas is, an open question, but you can look to them for the methods they used and the issues they had. It's important to realize that this is not just another rail station. You've got baggage and connectivity issues as well as intertwining security issues that you'll have to address. One of the issues that I wrestled with when I was a planner at San Francisco International is that we have two types of rail service. One, traditional heavy rail through what was called Caltrain, which is located adjacent to the airport. And then our regional transit rail called BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, that came in and has a station immediately adjacent to one of the terminals. In addition to all the other issues that go with this, well, let me back up a little bit. The BART terminal was adjacent to where large aircraft were being parked. So one of the big issues was how big of a bomb can they carry on the rail car for BART, and therefore how big of a blast wall do we need in their terminal to protect the adjacent aviation? Not a topic you're likely to bump into in other circumstances. So you need to remember that airports have their own set of requirements as you move forward with this sort of stuff. The other example you have from this is that we've got two rail systems, each with their own physical limitations, their own policy guidelines. You're going to have to work with them. Neither of these folks were connected into the local bus transit system. So you may face a thing where you're looking at several different systems and having to juggle that. And it's going to vary area by area, so you're just going to have to decide on your own. Yeah, we've talked about a lot of this, baggage issues a bit, use of airport property. In the interest of time, I think we'll just blast past this. We can deal with it in the question and answer if it's of interest. In looking at a somewhat smaller airport, maybe you can help me with this, Lisa.
Sure. I was fortunate enough to work at BWI for several years. And one of the great things about BWI is that it was located very close to some other transit links, and the airport was successful in linking in and pulling them all together. One of the great things about BWI was that it was located within 1 mile of the MARC and Amtrak system. So one of the natural things to come out of that was a free shuttle, so you could get off of the Northeast Corridor Amtrak train and take that free shuttle a mile and get to BWI, which is a much less busy airport than, say, Dulles was. There was also one of the great things that they came up with was sort of a limo bus connection, so that if you lived in D.C. but you didn't want to fly out of Dulles because maybe there was a closer connection or you wanted to use a Southwest connection, you could get a round-trip bus ticket from BWI to the nearest D.C. Metro stop. So you could go from the airport in Maryland, get on a limo bus for $6, and get on the large Washington, D.C. Metro system and get to your home, that maybe even in Virginia. In addition, there was a larger emphasis on providing shuttles and shared ride and providing bus service right at the terminal. One of the things that BWI tried really, really hard to do was to promote transit in the terminal proper. They tried to provide ease for coming and going, well, especially arriving passengers, by posting bus and terminal schedules, providing a comfortable seating area in the terminal where you could wait for your bus or transit connection. So the idea wasn't just, you know, once you're in the airport, you get your bags and leave. The idea was that you could use services in the airport to link to those other more local transportation services.
The final example I'll give in terms of facilities is that we talked about at some airports having a connection to a major airport. Probably the most elaborate one that I'm aware of is from the Van Nuys Airport in the Los Angeles area, where they've set a major facility of buses where people can park in the adjacent parking lot and structures and get an expedited ride into Los Angeles International. Now, this is not linked into the local airport per se, but is integrated with the facility. So this may be something you consider in transportation linkages. The other thing you need to look at is, since there is often a lot of land around airports and relatively clear perimeters, that pedestrian and bicycle paths can be a real possibility. The things that make airports somewhat more challenging, though, is the concentration of roads, some of which may be elevated. It may not have shoulders appropriate for bikes or pedestrians. Security is going to be heightened. And then the last one's a little tricky. All these facilities are going to have obligations through the federal system. And Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act says that eliminating a significant publicly owned park recreation area can only be done if there's no feasible alternative, and that minimize the harm to the property is part of the deal. So if you put in an elaborate bicycle path system and you later on need to eliminate it to provide aviation facilities, that may be increasingly difficult to do. So it's one of the considerations airports have to make because of their federal obligations. We talked a bit earlier about how to facilitate transit. It goes for high occupancy vehicles also. In other words, get those folks in closer to the terminal so they have some equal level of surface with people who are at service who are doing drop-offs. Good signing for people in the terminals so they can find this service. That can be a challenge at some airports. And again, comfort at the shelters to make this good for people with baggage. Some general conclusions.
This is Lisa again. One of the things we wanted to change is air traffic is increasing. It may not increase at the rate that FAA projects, but we know that it is going up. People are not going to stop using aircraft. And as the traffic, or as air traffic increases, so will roadway congestion near airports at larger commercial airports. So as a result of this, we're going to have to look more and more at more efficient transportation links. In the past, FAA, because it's funded from a separate bill than other surface transportation is, one of the things is that FAA and other transit agencies have not always talked to each other easily or only when it's necessary. Airports have in the past worked more, in a more isolated set of conditions. So what we're going to see is as the need for transportation links increases, the relationship between airports, airport operators, and other modal agencies such as FTA or Federal Rail or even local COGS is going to have to increase, and those relationships are going to become more and more interdependent on each other to be successful. The other thing is that airports aren't really considered outliers anymore. Metropolitan areas have grown closer and closer to airports. So we need to think about our airports as more part of a regional transportation system and as a regional facility rather than standalone facilities. So regional policy decisions are going to have to include airports. We're going to think about airports in terms of their contribution to a regional area, both economically and as transportation facilities. So I'd like to turn this discussion over now to Derek Kantar. Oh, sorry. One of the things we wanted you to take away with this is that in order to really be successful, we all as planners need to understand and get involved with public policy decisions that may be associated or focused on airports. As transportation planners, we need to be able to look at the stakeholders and decision makers that are involved in airport access, and that may not be just the airport. It may not be just the airport operator. It may be the COG. It may be the local community. And the other thing is that a lot of times as airport planners, we find that most of our interaction occurs with just the airport operator. As airport planners, I think one of the things that's incumbent upon us is to bring our client to a more regional table and sort of facilitate relationships with them and the greater community that may be beyond their jurisdiction. So now we're passing this along to Derek Kantar of the Caltrain Division of Aeronautics. This is an excellent source. Oh, sorry, Derek. Third time's the charm. One of the things is that Dave and I tried to base this presentation on our experience, but one of the things that we found was an excellent resource for planners was ACRP, or Airport Cooperative Research Report number 4. It came out in 2008, so the data are pretty fresh, and it talks a lot about methodologies and tools that are available for projecting transit needs to airports to link them to public transportation systems. I commend this particular publication to your attention if you want to learn more about this subject. So number 3, back to Derek.
Are you sure?
Yeah, it's all yours now. Go for it.
Okay, so no discussion about all this would be complete without getting into smart growth, because it is part of the planning vernacular nowadays. And as David was talking about trends in passenger service, cargo, how we're using the airport, the truth is regularly scheduled passenger service hub airports are not the predominant airports in the United States. In fact, it's the general aviation airport is what we have more of. Here in California, 80% of our aircraft activity is actually general aviation. So at the community scale and as planners, this is one of the things we think about or should be thinking about a little bit more often, is how we integrate our local airports, our general aviation airports, regardless of their scale, into the fabric of our communities. And we are doing that with smart growth. If the concept of smart growth in airports is unfamiliar, know that it's alive and well, and it's been going on for quite some time now. And what we're trying to do, particularly here in California, is bring smart growth concepts into the land use planning programs that surround airports. We can do this. We're doing it well. It's happening. I'm going to give you some examples of that coming up. But some of the things we need to think about when we talk about smart growth and we talk about the uses around an airport, because we are trying to make our airports compatible with our communities, is noise. One of the biggest issues that faces communities is the noise coming out of an airport. Now, we know airports themselves don't make noise. It's the aircraft, and aircraft have become quieter and quieter over the years, which is good. but at the same time there are some uses that just aren't appropriate right on top of your airport, and we can talk about that a little bit more. When we think about, before we get into smart growth, actually, what we think about is what kind of use are we trying to put next to the airport? What is compatible? And when we say aviation compatible, what we mean is, can that use handle being close to a runway safety area? Can it be close to a runway protection zone? Can it be close to the noise contours that come out of the airport? Many uses are very appropriate in that area. Others, such as residential, are not. And in fact, we don't like to put residential uses right on top of airports to begin with. When we think about the uses that we want to put around airports or near airports or co-locate with airports, Lisa introduced earlier, Part 77 are those vertical obstructions. Planes come in and leave an airport on fairly prescribed patterns. We want to make sure that there's not obstacles in the way of that aircraft. Trees, antennas, smokestacks, anything that goes up, we want to take a look at and make sure that it's not going to keep going up. Sometimes we look at some really nice landscape plans around an airport without realizing that the trees that were put in are going to, at some point in the future, penetrate one of those surfaces that, we don't want to go there and then have to come back later and say we need to start topping trees. So we're trying to get away from some of that, but we can, live advanced planning, we can work on that part. Some of the other things we think about around an airport are, what are some of the hazards that could possibly be put in that would cause us some concerns. There are open spaces around airports that for a long time have been natural buffers, agricultural areas, golf courses, what have you. Golf courses, particularly ones with water hazards, tend to bring in wildlife, and wildlife and aircraft usually don't mix so good. So we're trying to do what we can to minimize wildlife hazards. The FAA has a big project going on right now around the United States to do wildlife hazard assessments at various airports to understand and then reduce the conflicts between wildlife and airports. We've got a lot of those going on in California. Some of the lights from surrounding uses can be a challenge. An auto mall right next to an airport is a real glare hazard for pilots at night coming in on final approach. Some of the electronics that can come out of some uses around airports, such as wind turbines. In a time when we want to go green with some of our energy technologies, wind turbines have a proven impact on radar signatures. So how do we work with wind turbines? Solar panels are appropriate in some applications. Thermal plumes that can come out of some power plants can cause disturbance to small aircraft. So we want to look at how some of those uses come into being. But when we talk about compatible uses, one of the things we often don't think about when we look at our little GA airport is that airport can do more than just receive passengers or take off passengers. Small GA airports are really community-serving pieces of infrastructure. When we see a single-story terminal, one of the questions we get to ask ourselves as planners is, what would happen if that terminal was a two-story structure? And instead of having the typical flight shop, flight school, some of those type of uses that we would expect at an airport, what if there was an accountant in town who just loved aviation and wanted to have his accounting business at that airport? Is that a compatible use? Well, that's absolutely. And as long as the accountant likes being there, there's nothing wrong with that. It's fine. It's not incompatible with what's happening with aviation, and that lease payment to the airport helps keep the airport functioning. And since most airports are owned by the public or their community, anything to help defray the cost is a benefit. So we can be doing more with our general aviation airports than just seeing them for airplane or airport-only uses. Some business parks are coming up on airport property, on the land side. They are coming in. They're working well. Fixed base operators. This photograph here is one of the nicer fixed base operators, who makes a very nice, comfortable place where business travelers can come in. They don't have to leave the airport property to do business. They fly in. They hold their meetings here. There's a conference room, executive suites, what have you. They do their work. They leave. Everything they need is at that FBO. Okay. Other compatible uses we're seeing is that industrial uses, warehousing around the airport, these are really nice things to have because not only do they provide a buffer between the residential uses and the airport, but it also provides an opportunity for these packages, whatever, to be moved over to the airport quickly, efficiently. We're minimizing the truck trips on local surface streets. That's a good use. We've seen some small airports where unused hangars were used for small package transfers, so a little Cessna would come in and do that kind of air cargo. And not all air cargo are these big 747 freighters. There's good cargo being moved around in you know, little, yeah, it's perfect. And we can do more of these things at the community scale. Making connectivities between rail and truck and taxis and transit, they're working at airports. A lot of the pre-World War II transportation infrastructure did a very good job of connecting multiple modes of transportation. Post-World War II, we started to fracture our uses, tended to start separating some of our uses, particularly in the suburban sprawl era, all that. We started to get away from integrating our uses. We are through, you know, pick your planning paradigm, new urbanism, neo-traditional town planning, all that sort of stuff. We're starting to see airports come back to being a part of the fabric of their communities. And that's something that we're really a champion for out here in California, is trying to make those uses work a little bit better. Fun thing about some airports is that city departments or county offices are, since they already own the airport, they're moving some of their offices to the airport. Now, they get a reduced rate. They don't get it for free, but the cost of leasing to themselves is less, so that helps defray the cost of running, you know, that public department. Fun thing about this terminal is it's got a wonderful little banquet room hall that overlooks the airport, and it's kind of fun for people who like aviation. It's a chance to bring the airport into the community instead of having it as this departure or arrival only location. I will say that although historically we haven't done as much with smart growth in airports, that trend has changed. You know, we're really coming around to making things happen better. If you get a chance, go on the web, look up Chino Airport out here in California, Chino Airport Smart Growth Plan. They've actually specifically done one for that. Down in the San Diego area, Gillespie Field is putting together a gateway plan that incorporates a lot of smart growth elements into the way they integrate that airport into their community. Buchanan Field in Concord, California, had enough sufficient leftover land, it used to be a formal naval facility, that they have a small shopping mall. So, and it's creating airport revenues. So these things can work. So I guess what I want to say to conclude this part is that if we only think of our airports as takeoff and land airplanes, we're missing the big picture. Airports have historically done more. They can do more. They're certainly capable of doing more. And they can be a part of the community if we plan them wisely.
It would be thank you, Derek. It would be inappropriate to complete our presentation without thanking a couple of people, one of whom is Catherine Duffy. Catherine is one of the movers and shakers in the Transportation Planning Division, and she helped to put this webinar together, and I want to thank her for her effort. I want to thank the Caltrain Division of Aeronautics for giving Derek the time out of the office to participate with us today. And I also wanted to thank Ben Lee, who's been our sort of long-suffering technical guru as he helped us to set up this morning. Ben's with Ohio State, and this webinar couldn't have happened without it. So thank you to all of those people. And now I guess we'll take any questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And our first question is, when mass transit is used for airport to CBD, what percentage of people are deferred from cars and taxis?
Probably the best I've seen is the numbers for the Manhattan connection to the Newark airport, and they had 25%, which is got to be one of the highest in the country because of their unique situation with the rail connection. Don't have numbers elsewhere off the top of my head, but that's one that came out of the ACRB study.
Okay. There's a feedback, so I'll just leave the questions up on the PowerPoint.
The next question about the FAA policy statement about RPZ. I don't think that they're going to relocate every existing road in the RPZ, but certainly no new roads may be placed in the RPZ. Dave, have you had any more experience with that lately?
There's not a clear trend established, but the FAA is definitely getting tougher to deal with. What will probably trigger it is if the airport wants to do something or the community whose road it is wants to modify it. The FAA is likely to use any opportunity where somebody is changing something to say, oh, we need to correct past design problems. Probably your only defense is going to be physical impossibility or just cost impossibility. If it's a minor road, the FAA will go to great extent to get a road out of the runway protection zone off the end of an airport. We had a major project at the airport in San Luis Obispo where a fairly busy local arterial had to be moved on what seemed like a pretty trivial reason. So I expect that to be a bigger and bigger problem for people. But again, it's not likely to come out of the blue. It'll be triggered by something else.
Okay.
Okay, regarding the parking lot revenues when there's no one there to collect them, one of the things I've seen at smaller airports is the use of tokens. So when you come in, you get a ticket, you park, and before you leave, you present your parking ticket at one of the counters in the terminal, and they give you enough tokens to get out of the lot. That was done without any person in the parking lot. How successful it's been? It was successful for them. How broad the application is, I don't know, but it's one way that they were able to increase their revenues with minimal infrastructure costs.
Regarding Milwaukee, I understand that General Mitchell has an excellent connection to the Amtrak station that involves the use of a shuttle bus getting to and from the Amtrak station to the airport. The point that we were trying to make with the New Jersey Newark connection is that there's no change that you required once you get on that train at Amtrak. You go right to the airport, and there's no getting on and getting off to get from the train side to the air side, as it were. So, yeah, Wisconsin has a great service now. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay, gosh, does anybody?
Well, I came in from local government. The thing that in my particular case made it easy is the company I went to work for was moving into compatibility planning, and so they used somebody. They needed somebody who could speak local development processes. So depending upon exactly which form of transportation is to find a company that can use that as an adjunct to airfield planning, terminal planning. I think there should be, you have to do some research to figure out where the connection is, but that seems like a relatively easy connection. The other is, depending upon where you are in your career, just moving over, starting at the bottom may be a question. If you've been doing it for a while, that's obviously less interesting, and then you'll have to find a firm that has enough of what you do or can extend what they do to make it viable.
One of the other options, too, in here is most states have aviation planning rules of some kind, but most planners don't understand what they are. So if you can take it upon yourself to go get a copy of what those rules are and make your study on your own, become your own subject matter expert on it, and suddenly you become the go-to person pretty quick. In most planning programs, and I'm thinking, from the academic side, we really don't teach how to connect communities to airports in most planning curriculums. So when a planner takes it upon themselves to go ahead and get that information and start challenging themselves to become the expert, they very quickly become the go-to player.
And this is Lisa. I would recommend that you volunteer for projects that have a transportation link. I spent a lot of years when I started in planning sitting in an office cranking out NEPA documents until my boss got a call and said she needed to put a warm body at an airport to be adjunct planning staff, and it would be a 6-week assignment. Well, I ended up there for 5 years. So volunteer, get to know the folks in the planning offices in your local, regional planning agencies, and get to know the folks in airport planning agencies and volunteer, get to know them that way. And APA is a great venue for that. Question about high-speed rail. Can we go back? Can you go back one, Ben? There was a question about high-speed rail that I'm afraid we overlooked on the previous page.
One more. Advance one more. There we go.
There you go. Yeah. Diane asked about high-speed rail planners trying to make assumptions about how many flyers can be diverted. Derek, do you want to take a step?
Yeah, we're out here in California. We're working on our high-speed rail program, and this question comes up all the time within the state. And one of the things we're finding is that there's a certain cutoff when air travel just becomes more efficient. Period. And it's usually once it's over 500 miles, people tend to want to jump in an airplane because it really is faster. And high speed will always have a certain challenge in that you can only have a certain radius curve. You can only go uphill and downhill of a certain grade and still keep the train running at high speed. It's kind of hard to say exactly when someone is going to choose rail over aviation. But right now, what we're seeing more of is that once you get beyond 500 miles, it starts to become more efficient from a time perspective to take an aircraft. Regionally, that could change, but with interstate, intrastate, that will probably stand pretty firm for a while. Well, that's to be determined. Okay, next.
First one's a great question. The interesting thing is that the FAA does not directly regulate any heights near an airport. They say that the separation of states do not grant them the authority, that is a local land use decision. It's really the other way around. If the community does not regulate this, it affects the airport. For example, in the Las Vegas area, one of the very large casino towers actually eliminated an instrument approach. And so it's really the other way around. It's up to the community to take the FAA guidance and make sure it is implemented. The FAA can't do it. The only hook they really have is in broadcast antennas, where they do have an indirect regulatory. But other than that, it's a local city-county operation.
Just to clarify, FAA identifies the surfaces that must be free of obstructions. They point out how far those distances are based on the type of airport, the length of the runway, the type of approach and departures, et cetera, But as Dave said, the implementation of those FAA regulated airspaces and heights is up to the local jurisdiction.
Regarding the electromagnetic question, what the Air Force found in a lot of their studies was that one wind turbine 3 miles away from an airport wasn't going to cause a lot of EMS or electromagnetic field interference. When we put in these wind farms that we see on some of our ridge tops, where they're putting in all, 50, 100 plus wind turbines, those are the ones that tend to begin to cause interference. So what a lot of this comes down to is the scale. And 1 or 2, not so much. A wind farm, yeah, that's when things start to generate enough electromagnetics that we start seeing concerns with radar interference.
Okay.
And then the next one, very good point. Depending upon how much land you have at a given airport, how it's configured, where the taxiways are, the FAA may say the principal role of the airport is to serve aviation, and that these other uses are allowed, as beneficial as they may be financially, only if they are surplus to the needs of aviation. So in order to get to the point where rental space, leaseholds, whatever you have, or public facilities, you're going to have to bring the FAA to the table, since they are a party to all this, and say, okay, see, from a connectivity standpoint, we can't get aircraft over here because of the road circulation pattern, or based upon the size and type of airport we don't need this additional space. You can do that. Airports differ, FAA regions differ on how hard they're going to fight, but basically you have to have a real convincing argument, not just a, gee, we don't like our airport, so we're going to take some of its land. So the real issue, and you have to start by saying, are we meeting the aeronautical needs? If you are, then you have an argument to play with. But a great question.
Yeah, and also on this one quickly, GA airports tend to have a little bit more excess land than the big internationals, largely because a lot of the GAs we have are leftover military airfields. So they have more land than they may have needed. So we've got additional development opportunities that we typically don't have. One of the things the FAA gets concerned about is that when they grant monies to an airport for development, they want airport aeronautical uses. So if the extension of the terminal you're building and some of those things are privately funded or civically funded, you've got a little bit more leeway than if you're doing something that was done with a 100% FAA grant.
Okay, and I'd like to jump in about your question on parks and recreation uses, Tom. The 2 examples we gave you of bike trails, both near BWI and Portland, the point that we were trying to make with that slide is that those airports were very successful in developing walking and bike trails, but they developed them as transportation facilities. They are not parks. The airports were able to demonstrate that they were an alternative means of gaining access to the airport, and they also happen to be used by recreational bikers and pedestrians, but they are transportation facilities. Therefore, they're not 4F resources. And that was a very important distinction that they had to make when putting those particular facilities on the ALP. For example, PDX has an entire bicycle facility plan that talks about bicycles being a mode of accessing the airport rather than recreational facilities. So that was a real important distinction.
Yes, because we've had airports allow, quote-unquote, temporary ball fields to put on and then found out it's impossible to get rid of them.
Next. Ben, how many more questions do we have so we can try and see how close we can get to addressing all these?
We have about 7 or 8.
Well, we'll do what we can do.
Car planes, further projections on use of car
I have
planes.
no idea.
I don't understand the question. What are car planes?
Oh, yeah, I understand. I haven't seen anything recent on that, and I don't suspect it's really been studied that well, to be honest with you. A lot of folks don't even know how to make that interface happen right now. It's a nice concept. It's a really good idea. I don't know that anyone's really tested that yet, James.
Financial tools? Well, I don't know of anything new under the sun.
No, there isn't a whole lot at the moment. I mean, the FAA has their Airport Improvement Program grants. Some states have airport improvement matching dollars that they bring in as well. But for the most part, airport improvement grant monies, particularly from the federal government, all run through the FAA. We're starting to see a little bit more where the Federal Highway Administration will help with road access projects up to the fence, but there's still this little problem that the FAA dollars tend not to leave the airport fence or the airport boundary. But we've helped some folks leverage federal highway dollars and federal transit dollars to bring projects up to the fence of the airport.
Thank you for the comment on the BWI light rail station. I think we provided a picture of that but failed to mention it, so thank you for pointing that out. I'd also like to point out that when we're talking about better integrating airports with other plans, that's one of the things that we're seeing more and more of a need for. And this observation that aviation planning is so often remote is absolutely true. And that's why as transportation planners, it's incumbent upon us to bring our clients, if they are airport operators, to more of the region, to bring them to the regional table and facilitate a relationship between airports and regional planning agencies that's a bit more direct and a bit more integrated.
Probably one of the easier venues for that, if your airport happens to be city or county owned, normally the cities and counties are tied into the regional and adjacent communities much better than the airport may be. So there may be something through the city or county planning offices to make that easier. If it's an independent airport authority, you're just going to have to find interpersonal connections and professional connections to make that work.
On the urban transportation planning and airport bases, well, let's just broaden that to all military bases. But if there's an naval, air, Army airfield, they have an AirCUS, Airport Compatibility Installation Zone. It's their airport planning document, and that program is most commonly run by a civilian contractor on that base, and they have a pretty good understanding of how urban planning works. They were probably first brought in as a planner before they were brought in as a military installation planner. The Department of Defense is doing a really good job right now of knocking on the door of these various air installation planners and saying, please reach out to your communities a little bit more. You can do more. Their outreach process has significantly improved. So if you've got an air installation next to your community, you can probably knock on the planning door and say, how can we collaborate with you a little bit better? That outreach has improved significantly in the last few years, and I'd be surprised if someone really pushed back and said, we really don't want to play. They are doing a much better job now.
Yeah, there was a classic study on one of the bases, and I'm blanking on the name, but it was in the eastern United States where there was a significant research component with a large number of employees where they had a very elaborate connection into the adjacent communities and really almost functioned like a large corporation facility and much less distinct in terms of military. Obviously, there's the the fence and the security issue, but in terms of getting people to and from the facility, it was really just another community facility. So I've seen some examples. I wish I could give you the name of that facility, though.
The relationship really has improved in the last few years. Next. Yeah. I love this question on airport business plan. Absolutely, they've been successful, and in fact, here in California, that's one of the things we say on a pretty regular basis. If you don't have a business plan for particularly your GA airports, because the big internationals do this to some degree, but every GA airport should have a business plan. They should have a marketing plan. They should have these type of things so they can get a better return on investment. These local GA airports, the airport manager or the management staff should have a really good relationship with the economic development department of the county or city that they're located in. Business plans, those airports that have business plans have done very well. ACRP, Airport Cooperative Research Program, has put out some guidance reports on how to develop airport business plans. I encourage you to go look at those. They're available right now. They're working well. We highly encourage GA airports to put together a business plan.
I think the one caveat I would throw in is make sure it's the real deal and it's specific enough and tied into the real world. We have seen a sprinkling of examples of sort of economic development snake oil salesmen that are selling platitudes with a shiny cover. But real business plans can work for airports of all sizes.
Right.
Make sure you need to have the right people doing the job.
Right, David, that's a really good point. One of the things we really try to emphasize, particularly as planners, is every airport has a story. And your local airport should be exactly what it is. What is the scope and scale of that airport? It shouldn't be intended to be something that it's not. Airports can be very good community-serving assets if they're appropriately scoped and scaled for the community that they're in. So your business plan should be tailored to what the community needs that airport to do. Trying to over-embellish an airport is silly. You know, make it very realistic for your community.
Lisa, can you wrestle the last one? I don't think I understand.
Another thing that I want to point out is that commercial service airports are heavily subsidized. So I don't think it's fair to call them self-sufficient. They receive a lot of money from the federal government, but they probably have a greater opportunity for revenue generation. In terms of light rail, a New Start light rail, if there's a New Start light rail train that has the ability to connect to a hub airport, I'm not sure I understand completely what the question means. At what phase should that link be implemented? But I would like to say that in terms of new starts and other opportunities for linkages, I would think that the conversation about linking it to the airport should begin as soon as possible, because it's not just the link that goes out to the railroad, but all of the intermediate links that would be associated with it as well. And the opportunity for federal to federal consultation has to start very, very early in that process.
Mm-hmm. Part of the New Start and Small Start program with Federal Transit Administration is we always look at ridership. Do we have sufficient riders to justify the link? So at some point, one of the things we were saying out here was, if we know we want to bring in a transit connection, an LRT in particular, to an airport, but maybe we don't have the ridership right now to justify all the numbers that we typically want in a smaller New Start program, go ahead and purchase the right-of-way so that that's preserved, because the cost of buying right-of-way is never going to be cheaper than it is today. It's always going to be more expensive later. You can run bus rapid transit on it temporarily until you get the necessary ridership to justify the LRT. So one of the things we're trying to say is, don't wait to have all the numbers. Don't wait for it to be the perfect time to bring LRT into an airport. You can always buy the right-of-way and use other modes of transportation on it until you have everything you need to convert it over to rail. And we've seen some success with that concept. So in some respect, immediately is when you want to start working on your connection, but think about using that connection for more than just LRT. You can start it with a different mode. Check with the Federal Transit first, because sometimes they get a little bit leery if they are giving train dollars and bus rapid transit is on it. But there's ways to work through that.
And that's it.
Well, we made it on time.
Almost.
Thank you, everyone.